All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to webinar 12, our final soil health training program webinar. Today, we're talking about the soil health management planning with Carissa Stein, which will be very exciting. I'm glad you're all here for this. Um, Today's Tuesday, March 5th, town meeting day. So thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Lake Champlain Basin Program and NUEPIC for the funding to create this series. Agenda as per usual, a quick course overview and homework review, and then we'll hand it over to Carissa. We'll have Q&A and a couple points throughout, and then we'll talk about the next class, which is actually going to be the next in-field days. I'm very excited to share that we have all 4 workshop dates and locations scheduled, which is great. They'll start end of June and go through the beginning of September. Those are all at the bottom of your screen here. But don't worry, I will send out an email and calendar invites to everyone registered in this class for those events. Really hope you guys can join at least 1 or 2 throughout the summer, if not all 4. We tried to move them around all across the state so that people wouldn't have to drive a ton. But again, everyone's open to all 4 as well, hoping that you'll be there. And once again, this is our final webinar. So today's March 5th, and look how far we've come. We learned so much. Very exciting. Quick homework review. If folks were able to figure out what chapter I meant last week, it was chapter 24, putting it all together. So hoping folks got a chance to review some of that content from the book. And just a reminder that that book is there. It's online if you need it out in the field too and you don't have it. Please use it as a resource. It's a great reference. With that, I'm going to introduce Carissa Stein. She resides in Montgomery, Vermont, where she applies small-scale landscape changes with curiosity and admitted failures. She does this through learned techniques of animal integration, composting, gardening, ecology restoration, and soil health practices that she implements and observes. 9 years in the military forecasting weather for operations and 9 years working as a soil conservationist for NRCS has given her an additive experience to her perspective. Carissa is formally educated in weather, natural resources, and rangeland ecology. Raised in Virginia, she is grateful to have grown up on a small farm consisting of every animal you can legally care for and in a farming community with organizations like 4-H that initiated her exposure to agriculture. In her upbringing, she observed the rapid conversion of rural farmland to box store suburbia, which provided a frame of reference that elevates her regard for balanced land use. Carissa believes how the land is cared for is directly tied to how we care for ourselves and the next generation. We are inextricably tied to it and simultaneously to all the past generations that cultivated it. She hopes to create greater awareness around the soil in whatever way folks are willing to engage. With that, Carissa, if you'd like to go ahead and share your screen, we'll toss it over to you. Looking good.
Thank
And
you,
you can go
Lauren.
ahead. Yeah, thank you.
So appreciate to be here speaking on this topic, but also to be participating in such a huge effort to highlight soil health, not only in Vermont, but I think this is probably multi-state a bit and really important topic. Um, what a resource. So everybody's spoken about so many different facets of soil health. Um, And listening and learning from the other speakers, I started asking myself, well, what else is there to talk about? Apart from the final chapter that was a homework assignment, you know? And that is kind of how I wanted to present anything that I have found of use on the landscape, but also just working with the farmers. And so this is going to be kind of a collective aggregation of those additional Inputs that I think might be helpful context when either you're going to the farm, you're evaluating soil health, or in whatever facet that you actually find yourself engaged in soil health to include your own potential property. So for me, the topic of soil health is welcomed. Um, the past has been quite tumultuous for the state, and not that we have to linger on these type of things, but I think it's also important to acknowledge this because it will come into the additional context of when you're going out to a farm. So, you know, looking at, let's just say before we had widespread agriculture, what was the soil like in Vermont? Um, we've had statewide deforestation, sedimentation of rivers and lakes, statewide historical overgrazing, land development, land altering through drainage and bulldozers. And I'd also ask anybody that's here if you've seen anything on the landscape that has been done historically to alter the soil. So you may have heard of web soil survey. Um, I'd like to introduce a couple other aspects of how you can actually assess the soil or at least the context of the farm before you go out. And why I say this is because it's kind of going to give you a bird's eye view. So before you step on the farm, before you make a either a prescription or even actually like put the shovel in the ground, the additional broad context of the landscape can be extremely helpful, or at least I find it helpful in my personal perspective. So tools that I can look at depending on what the applicant is actually asking for. You could go to Web Soil Survey. You can also use Google Earth Pro, which has an overlay of actual web soil survey. And this is helpful because you can get soil profiles immediately. You can also get ecological site assessments for some soils, not all. They are currently building those and working on those and adding more information all the time. Um, but I would submit to you to potentially look at the farm a little bit more than just punching in the address and how to get there. And continuing with this, but going just a step further into how, sharing what I do before I step out onto a farm. Um, so I might go into Google Earth, I'll utilize the soil web, and then I'll start looking at the soil profiles, how they differ across the landscape, and then usually sometimes it's a refresher, but if I'm working in another county or an area that I'm not familiar with, um, because Vermont can be so different across the landscape, familiarizing yourself with with that soil that is mapped there and the profile. What you see in Web Soil Survey and what you may see in the information here may be completely different than what you will see on that agricultural land. So whether annual or perennial, a lot of these soil profiles were mapped as the original forested state. So they'll talk about in some of this information, they will talk about where they took this soil profile and the description of it, and it'll typically be under a forested floor in its original state. So in these soil profiles, if you see AP, for folks that don't know, that would be cloud disturbed, anthropogenically changed. And basically the inversion of the soil profile. And so that might be similar to how it's mapped, but nine times out of 10, you're going to see how they describe that soil in its natural state. And that's can be quite different in the Champlain Valley versus uh, farther east. So continuing on with this historical context, the picture on the left is a 1941, I believe that's 1941, uh, nope, sorry, 79, snapshot. No, I take that back one more time. That's a 41. Okay, sorry. It's built these slides a little while ago. So, and then looking on the right, you're looking at approximately 2024, but it's probably like 2022, 2023. Um, the landscape has changed over time. And you could actually see this in some of the cache soil samples. You could see it in the shovel. Um, you could see it walking the land, how one part of the field looks completely different than the other, but based on your pre-assessment, the soils were supposed to be the same, minus any topographical changes. So I've seen this play out in cache samples where across the board the farm had, high organic matter, and then on this one area it was much lower, and I'm like, what's going on there? And so before even stepping out on the farm and seeing the management that's currently be applied, I can look at, oh, that area was tilled, it was plowed, it was shifted. And we're going to talk about a couple things that could build back that organic matter up in addition to everything Heather told you. But so after this land was plowed, there was an imbalance created, and it hasn't quite been set back yet. Um, Thinking about another aspect of historical floods. So in a floodplain soil, that develops completely different than how a forested soil does, almost like a rebirth. It's it hasn't been aged and it doesn't have that developed soil profile that you've learned from some of the other folks. And so you're going to see a depositional soil that may be completely different than what you've seen in the field right next door because it had a flood, because it had a depositional um, aspect to it. And one other thing I would note here, especially if you assess a lot of soils around Lake Champlain, they may not be mapped as floodable. And so you can go back through Google Earth imagery. I believe 96 is the farthest that they go back, and you can visibly try to assess whether or not that area actually had flood during the high points in Lake Champlain. You can also tell that by the elevational levels around the lake. Um, and for some folks on this call that might be doing resource concerns assessments, and if they ever have to answer that question, does this field flood? Potentially, and it might not show up in the soil mapping. Um, just something for inner assessment to be aware of. Oh, yeah, we'll keep going. Old homesteads are, before I do step off of this, old homesteads were everywhere. Um, there have been places where farmers have asked me, where did the sinkhole come from? And then going back and looking through the aerial imagery, there used to be a homestead there, and it's probably something that's buried, and it's just now um, the water is finding its way subsurface. I promise we're still on soil health, but just adding context to before you you know, make recommendations, do assessments. We have a long history of agriculture, and so that because soil is kind of like a footprint on the landscape, sometimes it can be very important to what you're trying to find out or the solutions that may be needed.
Hey, Riss, while you're still on that slide, actually, I do have a question in the chat.
Great.
What would be the typical impact of development upslope of agricultural soils?
Great question. It's probably varied depending on what the topography is like, but let's say that you have a farm that is in a lower topography and you have a place that is developed upstream of it, it's going to have additional water flow trying to either move through the farm or let's say if the farm is a wetland, might get wetter. And in certain aspects and based on the weather that we've been seeing that fluctuates seasonally, but and to the degree that it's an issue for the farm, but it still should be taken into context in how those soils were mapped and then what we're seeing if the change is outpacing um, the dynamics of the soil. There's probably a whole toolbox of tools to address some of that. Um, and hopefully there's a financial resource for the farmer to deal with some of those issues. One other situation that apart from additional water flow is nutrients. I've seen a farm that's adjacent to a golf course, and it definitely played in the amount of um, the type of vegetation that they were seeing pop up along that water course.
Thank you.
And one other aspect while we're on this, um, your local NRCS offices um, have this aerial imagery in print. Some of it's been digitized to a certain degree, and some of it has not. Your major years, your best years for like how clear cut this is the 41, 74, and there's a couple other in there, but that information is still held and can be of use sometimes. All right, so I'm just moving this video over so I can read. And so a couple folks on this call have been in other discussions with me about context, and I'm looking for another word and how to describe this, but the more information, the better that you can get. So, um, and some of the folks on the call have also been doing this for quite a bit, and this is like, yeah, I already know that. So I apologize for any redundancies, but some folks are stepping into their careers, are just starting out, or are really utilizing this as a training of like, okay, I'm going to start doing farm visits, or I have to go do X, Y, and Z. So, um, yeah, I appreciate any patience or redundancies. So a lot of the farms, at least in my experience, have had quite a few folks work with them. And it may all have been around soil health in one way, shape, or form, but maybe called something a little differently. But um, the more in-office information you can utilize or folks that have already worked with them, the better, just to reduce some of the redundancies for that farm to be repeating the same information that we might already have on the books and already know. Um, and also additional context, this is apart from the soil health, but this is in the context of the farm and helpful for the farmer just for general awareness. Like, do they have a website? Taking a look at that website and seeing what they make, seeing kind of the tone, you can kind of glean like their goals. Um, And also, if they filled out an application, sometimes there's details in those applications that are very helpful in context for your actual visit. And um, and it might be very clear that they're interested in soil health, or they might be interested in something that is inextricably tied with soil health. Um, so just trying to glean all of that information before you show up at the farm can be very helpful. Um, Something that NRCD is really excellent at is if it's a new farmer or applicant, bring in material that might facilitate other connections for them. I mean, they wrote a reference guide, Assistance for Farmers, and there's a lot of assistance out there. Luckily in Vermont, I think Jeff Sanders mentioned other states. There's some gaps, and any way that we can fill those gaps, it can be really helpful for the farmer, and especially if you have the time to assist them with the paperwork or facilitate one less stamp or trip to the office. So just thinking about that, like, or if you know somebody's working with them on another project, say, is there anything that they need to sign? Or, this is kind of how the multi-agency relationships have been kind of making it all work for them. And I would really applaud anybody that tries to do that. And the information on their soils that you find, doesn't matter how technical it is, sometimes they do want to see it, or at least bring it for them to see and talk about at least the high points on it, what's of interest. Um, Besides this slide just, oh, it's so cute. I like it's part of why I love going to farms, but another thing is for especially for the new folks that are on this call and maybe they've got farms that they got to go to and they feel a little intimidated or they're not quite sure how they're going to approach a situation. I'd really just ask that you re remember like that, you know, they're a farmer, you might be an agency person, you're both human beings at the end of the day. And if you kind of remove those categorical, like, we boxes that we like to put each other in, at the end of the day, heart to heart, it's another human being that you can go have a great conversation with. And um, if you can share your knowledge and they can share their knowledge, it's one of the best types of relationships you can develop with a farmer or landowner, because I'm sure there's folks on here that it may not just be farms you're working with. So soil health management planning. Ooh, you can go out to a farm and think that you're going for one particular reason, or maybe they have said, hey, I want to focus on my soil health. Let's get started. Goals are very important, of course, um, and should be a lead driver of the conversation. Definitely getting a clear understanding of what that farm is trying to achieve. Um, and they might say, I want to do this practice. You're going to have to also, or I'd submit to you to look at everything within the context of that farm visit. So they might have an issue that can be solved through soil health that they're not aware of. There's a practice for that, you know? So it's one that it's like you might be showing up on the land for one particular reason, but in your observations, in your listening, you might either really get to a deeper issue at hand, um, or might be really pleasantly surprised of a really easy fix. Uh, that just through a shared perspective, they didn't know it was an issue. Um, there's always those opportunities when enough time and capacity for observation and conversation can really come at hand. There are a, there's a few farms I can think of right off the top where I personally worked with them for years and thought they're just so busy. I don't want to bother them with when I go out and do my assessments. I wish I would have. I wish I would have said, "Hey, we got to go take a look at this," or "I saw this, and let's go take a look at this in your field." Um, yeah, I was just trying to move the bar, but so we're going out to the farm, and this aerial that you're seeing here, this landscape is sloped. It's got a lot going on, and there had not been farming on the land for a while, apart from somebody managing a hayfield. And there were all these, like, it was a new farm starting out, and there were so many ways to get them started on the right foot of what they were trying to achieve. And that was by looking at the land, the plant community, how the water table was revealing itself. And so what you're seeing right now is some of the aerial where the water is shedding off of the land. And, so in the yellow circle, there was a wet seasonal high water table, and the landowner was talking about putting a high tunnel here. That I could see like in a dry season, they could think it'd be perfectly fine. But there there would be times where they would be having potentially a catastrophic issue with that greenhouse with a high seasonal water table. But they couldn't see that at the time that they went and walked the land. And so there are cues, there are plant communities, there are all type of things that you can assess before even walking onto that farm um, that will help guide the conversation or answer their questions. And then where you see field assessment 9 and 10 on the upper left, these were plant communities that were already into a what I would call a low fertility, high meadow status, and also some poison parsnip coming through. And so looking at the seasonal high water table, the shallow to bedrock, the shallow to a perched water table, and then the overall plant community, it would take them a lot of work to get that up to a certain part or a certain type of land use that they were actually thinking about. And we talked about other strategies for land management that they could utilize that might be better fit for what their overall goals were. And they really, really appreciated it. So one of them would be a wildlife habitat. Um, they were also thinking about this whole agritourism as well. So being agricultural, but also having spaces where people could go um, to do bird watching, to do the pollinator assessments. And so, you know, for number 10, if they had decided like we're gonna run a tractor through there, you can tell by all the water. Uh, hopefully you can see my pointer. That's a lot of water coming off that slope. It might be quite the headache for anybody just starting out, that may not have all the resources, extension agents and everything else out there yet, really tied into the community. And so that's another thing that was mentioned. So if you've got a farm that you're there for soil health, but they have all these other questions, really tying them into the communities at hand, like the conservation district, like extension, like AFT, like all the other agencies are on this call, NRCS, FSA, you know, and also abiding that, farmers are a staple of the community. So really getting your foot in the door in the community, and finding out who to talk to when. So we're talking about soil health. And here I have a plant slide in front of you, but it's so important. Um, so I haven't been to a farm yet that doesn't have additional context, of the natural plant community to be looked at. You might be looking at a cornfield, but there might be, um, additional context growing along the edges or in the middle of the cornfield that could help you understand what's going on year long. And this kind of ties into, um, it's more of an ecological perspective, uh, how these plants are in relation to the soil. And a lot of farms, don't just have agriculture, they have these small spaces that they're managing for. And I get questions all the time. What is this growing? And so knowing your plant communities and why they're there, can also give you additional insight. These these are listed, and I would also ask, in the chat, potentially pasting your favorite, phone app for IDing plants. There's a whole host of them out there. I've heard all different types of preferences. Some of the shortfalls on some of them are when the leaves are off, also identifying grasses and sedges and mosses. And so these four books, you can find for sale, but you can also now get them free digitally. So, um, and I have the additional information at the end slide, but those four are the best well-written, um, plant ID books that I have come across for our area. And these are usually the plants that the phone apps can't quite get a handle on. So and also if you're going to be out in the field and you're field personnel, it's always good to have additional resources for plant ID. And then the wetland, woodland, and wildland, that looks at the soil, that looks at the region where you're located, and has a description for the plants that you may find on those, sites. And so a lot of times when I'm working with farms, it often tends to bleed out of the just what we would typically think of as agricultural fields. Another resource for this is you had the topic on agroforestry. And so for agroforestry, some trees grow really well in some areas, and sometimes they don't grow so well in other areas. This can give you insight as far as, additional considerations for that soil type, on the landscape. All right. In line with that, so this slide is also when you're on the farm, starting to do assessments. But I tied this in with the plant communities that we were just talking about and why it's also important. And this isn't like a typical like, oh, when you're going about soil health on the farm, this is step one, this is step two, this is step three. I apologize if I'm confusing anybody. but it's like when I look at a landscape and a farmer asks me a question about their field, these are other things that I'm thinking about and taking into context. And so, a big thing that I know a lot of folks have heard about, but I really want to reiterate is this whole fungal to bacterial ratios. And you're always going to have bacteria in a system. Um, they're always going to be a prominent part of a population of the soil, I believe. But then you can also have very low fungal community to extremely high fungal community. And as you can see on the left-hand side, um, taking this from another presentation that was done, but it has, the low carbon to a high carbon. And so the application for this would be if you were out in a field that was, let's say, just tilled or highly disturbed, and somebody said, I want to plant trees here, this is what you want to start thinking of immediately. You're going to have to add carbon. Apart from all the other aspects of the chemical properties of the soil and the structure, the another facet of it is going to be increasing that carbon in that soil profile. And I added the stability to that slide because it's another aspect of this. So um, you've heard from a couple speakers about tilling and then potentially detrimental to fungal communities. So that disturbance aspect, another reason why we're concerned about worms within the forest and to the degree that those worms are active is because they are creating a certain disturbance pattern, and that is a, a, a disruptor, right? So a little bit less stability. And so that also plays into this. And also with any type of disturbance pattern, we're also introducing oxygen and we're also burning some of that carbon. So that's kind of all tied in there. Um, yeah, how this could actually also help you is, a farmer's asking, well, I used to have X, Y, or Z in this field, and now I'm seeing this. And without a soil test, um, although soil test is still recommended, but in my mind, I start looking at, okay, what are the other plant communities? What are the plants that are popping up here? Um, Sometimes farmers will ask you, well, I had all these great grasses and now I'm starting to see asters or goldenrod pop up into my field, or there's a whole host of plants out there that can show you that there might be a disruption pattern going on that you're not seeing right then and there, but over the context of a year at some point, um, either they're creating, they could be introducing more disturbance, or they could be dropping in fertility, or um, losing some of that bacterial component and seeing a higher ratio of the fungal. Um, the bacteria is probably still there. However, the stability and the type of population that are there are shifting out. They're, I believe they're called K strategists versus R strategists. And I'm not quite sure I want to go down that rabbit hole. But overall, it's transitioning. And so those plants can give you that context in the same way that um, these, you can kind of figure out, okay, what else is going on with these fungal to bacteria ratios that are important um, in these plant communities. So just another way to say pretty much the same thing, but I just think it's pretty important. And so, on the bottom right, this is what you would be seeing um, above ground and below ground, essentially. I don't think it's completely true because um, the overall thought that uh, roots just go deeper, anybody that's seen a tree lodged over, it may not be the case, you know, but it apart from a couple aspects there. And then, yeah, just another way of viewing that whole plant succession ladder um, on the upper left. Okay, so you're on the farm and they're asking you soil health questions. How do you know without looking? Truly. So I'd really reiterate that looking at the soil and discussing what you both see. What do they see? What do you see? What are the takeaways? Because they know the management. They know what's been done, at least to a certain degree, um, past couple years. And so you can look at these shovels and it can just like light bulbs go off. Um, and also another part of it is they might see the soil um, in a totally different way, especially if you're doing a fence row comparison, which I have slides on. But it, it just gives them more context for what their management's doing, but also for you definitely on what is going on here on this farm. So the fence line or edge of field comparison, uh, trying to make it as much as apples to apples as possible. So like, you know, having a field and then stepping over into a wetland um, may not be a good reference site. But taking a sample in the field where they've been doing their management and where it hasn't been managed as much, or you it, know it's that it's a similar soil and it probably hasn't had quite as much degree of management going on. And these side by side comparisons. So the one on the left, this is a cornfield, corn silage, and they cover cropping was done. It was done very late in the season, um, conventionally tilled, although they've been transitioning quite a bit, which is great. But on the left-hand side, you see the darker, rich aggregation slash organic matter. On the right, minimal pore space, giant clods. You know, when it rains, which one's going to infiltrate? Which one is probably having to some degree an extraction of carbon versus putting it back in? Which one has a healthy bacterial, because the darker your soil is, apart from being looking um, at manganese, but the darker your soil is, you're looking at carbon or you're looking at organic matter in that soil. And so even without a soil test, yet you can kind of gauge to the degree of how that management is affecting that in-field assessment. And I'll I'll pause here for a second. I want to do a time check and I want to see Lauren break questions, whatever anybody needs.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions, or I guess comments about some of the apps that folks are using. And so someone said
Great.
they've used PlantNet because it lets you add multiple pictures for ID and specify if it's a picture of leaves, flowers, bark, and fruit. Um, and then someone else added that they've never had much luck with the plant ID apps. Sometimes Google Lens can help narrow things down or confirm your guesses. Otherwise, you can't go wrong with the Peterson field guides.
Yeah.
Um, at this point, that's all of the questions besides confirming that it was Gibu in that dog in that picture with the cow. your lovely, adorable
Yeah.
dog. Um,
No, I did
yeah,
not present without slipping in a picture of her. Yeah.
she's too cute not
Thank
to.
you.
Those are all the comments in the chat at this point. If you want to keep rolling, you are welcome to. Got about an hour and 10 minutes left,
Okay.
just so you know. Cool.
Okay. And I do have an actual break slide coming up, so anybody that needs that, just FYI. So you may not have a farm that you've done cash tests with. They've got great instructions that are delivered with them, and so you can really take a deep dive into that. This slide is to kind of submit like, all right, we got these cash tests back, and now there's so much information that just got landed in our lap. And the cash test might say, and I think Lindsay brought this up, might say, oh, it's perfect, it's 100%, but we're not getting any, the farmer's not seeing what they want out of that field. Let's put it that way. So now it's side by side, looking at the numbers, looking at the differences in the field. That's the analyzing the data, but then also kind of color coded, like pinpointing things and writing out like why this might be different than the field right next to it. Or you took two samples because they had a different management on it and they wanted to know how that management was affecting it. And so that's where some of these side-by-side comparisons and highlights can help. Same thing in the soil, the UVM or any soil chemical test, basically doing a side-by-side comparison, overall, finding out what is low across the board, what's high across the board, and this can help formulate a conversation around nutrient balance on the farm, which I'll talk about too. But this just this for me is very helpful about wrapping my head around some of this information. And it there's a lot of info here, and um, but I will submit that sometimes, like in the nutrient analysis that you'll get back associated with these, it may say 100 score, but then you look at the nutrient levels, and that could be an issue. So um, there were fields that we got back that we did the shovel test, and we noted some issues, and then like the aluminum came back super high, and so that was a great correlation with the visual of the field and then the analysis that we got back. And that kind of gives you a two and two together, and also potentially context for the farms moving forward. Like, oh, I saw this issue and we got this test back, and this farm doesn't want to take cash test, but it's kind of a reference. We saw the same issue in that other farm, and all things, everything else being taken into consideration. Just not making that decision off of um, that one thing. So it's also helpful with farms, if you, to also show them other ways of looking at it. So this is just a bar graph illustrating like, okay, these are all your fields, and this is one of the outliers. And in this particular one, active carbon. And at the end of the Cornell cache results, they give you like some management that you can potentially include in some of your solutions. And so that's another thing that might be helpful. On field X, the active carbon was low, and here's some of the short-term and the long-term management solutions that we could start to look at. So over the long-term soil health, um, this kind of gets at a balance, right? And it's something that um, is a big deal and it can be talked about in many different ways, but helping a farm find nutrient balance and also probably nutrient distribution is really pivotal. And it's an ongoing solution aspect. And meaning what I mean by that is what we knew 5 years ago, some of the stuff we never would have thought of that we're seeing today. Precision ag is one of those things that we could probably talk about. Um, and then reduction of soil loss. And what I really mean when I'm not I mean soil loss, but I also mean like the organic matter. So like some of the gully pictures that you saw in previous discussions, that is now down to a subsoil. Or let's say that you have a farm that is clearing an area that just has grown up into trees and they're like, I want more farmland or I'm reverting it back to farmland. And they not doing it mindfully they might take off the actual organic layer. And once you get down to a mineral soil, you've set yourself back big time. So you've either got to add an animal component for the biological aspect, or you've got to bring in the amendments. You you can't grow a good crop off of just the mineral base. You need the biology to it. So there's probably a lot of experience on the line that has seen this in many different ways. And you know, some of the goalies, like, okay, well, they go through and they harrow and they fix it, but then they see crop loss the next 10 years. It would be good to have the context of putting that organic matter back appropriately, seeding it down, what have you with the water dynamics, but um, that biology factor is a big thing. And then nutrient efficiency. So that might also include different ways of applying in different time frames. So matching crop uptake, but also distribution over the land. Um, a lot of farms can have an excess area and then an area that's low on everything. Um, so figuring out ways to redistribute and balance it. And then, of course, I talk about import export here, and this can we tend to think of in Vermont, oh, we have too many nutrients. Um, that's not the case on every farm. So if they're in a closed cycle system and they're not importing that much, but they're exporting a heck of a lot, what happens over time? It's just an equation. It's like it's a balance, and the more that a farm can efficiently use their nutrients and reduce the potential that they're going to lose any of that soil, although it's not an absolute. Everything erodes. Like even if you've got a sod, Russell 2 will still spit out a number of loss. But um, yeah, big deal for a farm economically over time. Yeah, planning can look a lot of different ways, and the maps can be amazing. But I'd submit to you, like we're seeing, at least I saw a high amount of folks that wanted to diversify, looking at their landscape different. We have a lot of areas that are not, um, fields that vary with characteristics, and they're like, I am not getting the best out of this field. Why? And so if it's an inherent characteristic of the soil, maybe we want to think about diversifying if the farm is able to. That's going to vary for every single farm, and that's not going to be a solution for everybody. But at least having um, the the open eyes and looking for the opportunities for this farm. So whether it's grazing, cropping, agroforestry, any of these different ways of co-creating with the land, making food. It's all planning for soil health and land use. And the wider the context and thought pattern, I think the better for the farm overall. Because some areas just have different characteristics and are going to be potentially a headache or um, a financial asset. This is reiterating the static nature or the snapshot nature of a plan. So you write down a bunch of stuff and you say, this is what we're going to do. Um, that plan needs to have capacity to change and um, it has to have check-in points. So documenting the initial, but also the farmer does the actual thing that's prescribed, and then what happened and where are we at now? Um, they can do this themselves, but like just to know to have check-in points and bit points and assessments. So you really want to do after you do that initial assessment, that's not the end all be all. Um, you make that plan, then do, observe, reflect, and then do. It changes year to year as we saw, especially this past year. And I'd submit that records that are relevant to the record keeper. So what's helpful for the farmer, um, as far as recording the process. Hmm. Every farmer is different. This is another context thing. Like I couldn't tell you like this is where you're going to start. This is what you should kick off with. Every farm is different. A lot of it's going to be directed out of their goals and then what you observed, but trying to read the room, so to speak, and really get curious. There have been so many times where curiosity really helped. You just asking those open-ended questions, and getting kind of unfurling a little bit, um, probably will end up in a better solution, um, than if it's just a yes, no, this is what I want. Um, Especially if you're getting other cues that um, a, a different solution would be better for them. Yeah, and at the end of the day, I think Jeff mentioned the psychology of farmers is that's what it's all about. Um, at the same time, once they want to do something, if they're going to take that leap, if they can do it in confidence, so everything that you can potentially assist them with that you feel comfortable or can help with, all the better. Because, they're taking a risk, and it would be really nice to have either an open communication, a safety net in some way, shape, or form. And then, of course, it's been mentioned before, but starting small, if it's a big, big leap for them. Yeah, and so this is why we have all these workshops, right? This is why UVM Extension puts on a great field day. Excuse me, seeing is really believing. So if you're not familiar, Usain Bolt, uh, year after year after year at the Olympics, people can't run that fast. People can't do that. New world record, right? And I would submit to you that somebody saw that happen and then either wanted to exceed it or wanted to do it. Um, and so that's another aspect of this in soil health as a Vermont community. If you have those farmers where you're having those conversations with them and they're waxing and waning, extend that hand, come out to this workshop, come meet this farmer. Let's go see so and so. Uh, Maybe not bother them, but while they're trying this new practice. with permission. You know, seeing is believing. And I think that unfortunately, or just not unfortunately, it's just part of who we are. We might be setting some limitations unconsciously just because we've never seen it. Um, yeah. Uh, this is way out there, but I remember thinking when I'd go to a farm and I was going to go talk about soil health. I knew that this farmer just got dinner from a fertilizer company or from this other representative, and who am I to come out and show them, um, a shovel? But it's important. It's really, really important, and I do think that farmers are interested, or at least there's gaining interest out there to take that time to share with them um, what you see and what lights you up a little bit, maybe a shared passion, because you will see their passion come out with that conversation. Um, everything is connected to soil health, in my view, for the most part, unless you get into some really nitty-gritty things. But so if if they're talking to you about an issue, but they're not saying key characteristics soil health, you don't have to throw the soil health word at them. But under, for you to understand that connecting the dots to everything, how interconnected all of these things are, can be helpful and can actually, um, you know, in in gl- pivot into something that they're really interested in. Like I've been having issues with drought, um, but they might not outright say that. So, and it can also formulate the solution, you know, the type of cover crop, um, the type of tillage that you might want to pivot to, the crop rotation. Uh, these things, they're all connected. So if you can help connect those dots, would be helpful. These conversations can be very tough. Um, so, but to a certain degree, I'll generally say it also from a business point of view, it's a loss. They're losing fertility, they're losing that topsoil that we were talking about and the ability to grow future crops. And then I've seen a lot of ditches that are filled in based off of the soil that they're losing. So they're redispersing their topsoil into a ditch and then filling up the drainage that they want. And in some of these really wet years, it would be ideal to keep it on the field, right? So not never approaching it in an accusatory way, but really like just connecting the dots from an economic point of view. Uh, relevant plans to the farmer. So Lauren wanted me to put this slide in, so I'm looking at she wanted me to talk about this. So the if folks have seen the grazing chart, this one would be kind of akin to a soil health chart. So helping think about the goal for the year, your soil health focus, and then maybe how you'll do that. But and then kicking off like August to like August, a whole year, right? So moving into winter, how are we going to have that cover? Um, I'd like to say that we may not want to be spreading all of our nutrients out there. Jeff talked about efficiency of nutrients in one way, but in reality, we have a lot of pits that need to get emptied or capacity for storage that needs to be addressed. And so if something's going to go out in the field, where's the best placement for that? Um, and then same thing in the spring. What do we need to be thinking about? Where do we need to be cover cropping? And this would just be a different way of putting a plan out there apart from like maybe an aerial view of a map, um, or just a written plan verbally. plants, I think I mentioned before, they should breathe. So if they're static and the farmer is following it to a T, we failed. The land is dynamic, right? So we should be doing, assessing, potentially shifting what's going on. Um, so if possible, allow pivots, tools, livestock changes if they're able to. Um, Potentially also thinking about if you're doing a 1 to 5 year plan, there are a lot of programmatic assistance for those. I would submit that if you're doing a 5 year plan, or if you're doing conservation stewardship program, maybe thinking about a 5 year plan because it's a 5 year contract and it's based on a resource level, a resource management system. So within that, there has to be wiggle room for pivots, and and that's up to the farmer and all context based for the farm. But if they need to pivot and they feel contained by a contract that they didn't know that they couldn't make this change, that's an issue, right? So um, let's say that they have a hayfield and resource concern level, it's at a perennial hayfield. It's got zero soil loss. But they're saying, I got to plant corn there because this other field flooded out. Can they make that pivot? If they can, great. And I'm not going to talk about the contractual aspects of that. Please talk to somebody with NRCS that is currently working for NRCS. But I would say that, you know, for certain programs and length of those programs, what could happen in those 5 years, and the farmer needs to know um, all the details of those programs. Break time. Sorry. Thank you.
Thanks, Carissa. Um, I guess one question I had when you were kind of working through some of the history of the landscape and different soil types is just thinking that, gosh, having these conversations with farms before they buy land would be really helpful,
Mhm.
especially new farms. And I guess I'm just wondering, are certain types of farms better suited for certain types of soils? I know that's a little prescriptive. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Intuitively, I said yes, and I'm like, are you just saying yes, or is there um when when they did the soil mapping in the state, albeit that was a long time ago, but that's where we started in the soil health aspect, right? We were very much looking at the physical, even before the chemical, we were looking at the physical characteristics of these soils, and the inherent properties of them. And there are some soils in the state where they basically discuss um, suited to pasture. You won't even see crop field, right? Um, we have a farm very close by that you're aware of. It is a hillside farm. It was probably forest, you know, long-term forest. What I just mean the difference between Champlain Basin and up here in Montgomery. And they had built one of the just best utilization of land possible. So what I mean by that is it's extremely diverse. And they're growing anything from they're doing more of an agroforestry um aspect to it. And it's amazing. These soils are more, at least where I'm at, would be more conducive to a woodier species, but we have a ton of goat and sheep farms that are excellent. Um, so there are a few things that I won't say it's not impossible, but it might be quite the lift economically to get it to a certain point. I'm a big fan of animal integration, as we'll see more later in the presentation, but um, you know, at least if you're living on a land that was in a forested aspect, um, you're going to have to bring in that fertility.
Thank you. I like the answer. Um, we have a question from Mel. Have you found that the term soil health can have negative connotations in conservations with farmers? I'm thinking about the way that folks may talk around the term climate change, which may shut down a discussion with folks. Have you ever had that for soil health?
If somebody got a pushback just from or created a wall just because of the term, I can't point to a specific situation, but there are terms that we use in society that uh, artificially create a barrier, right? So um, that might be a nuance of your approach to a farm being very, like I mentioned, being open. I also mean being open-hearted, like listening, like don't put it up any walls, you know, between and trying to use that neutral language, if possible. Because like we're human, we all have accumulated a lot of thoughts and there's a lot of information out there. And at the end of the day, we want to have successful farms and we want to have functional landscapes and healthy ecosystems, whether it be below ground or above. So I would say um, if you can refrain from accidentally building a wall, even if you don't know you're doing it. Also, if they have pushback on it, say, how can we open this conversation in a different way? Not using that exact verbiage, but you know what I mean.
Thanks. And then a question from Dorothy. What advice do you have for creating plans that have room to adapt or to breathe and adapt when some operational changes require new equipment, training, and other significant investments from a farmer?
Yep. Um, Sometimes if I'm writing a plan, I'll talk about as able, not making it to the farm like that they have to do it tomorrow and that this is a key component because we can already like pull in like exactly what they're going to do maybe within the next year. And sometimes when you write out a plan, you might be including a lot of information that can scare a farm a bit, but like um trying to help them build stepping stones of like, okay, we'll get this figured out and then we'll move on to this. So that's one part of the sequential aspect of it. Now the breadth of it would be, you know, you can make suggestions like in times of drought, here's a suggestion. However, also including in the verbiage, um, in some way, shape, or form to the best of the farm's ability, or um, leaving the management decision up to the farm. Like, because at the end of the day, they need to do what they need to do. Um, and if they're working with you with a soil health plan, they already start with the best of intentions, right? So we don't really want to box them in any way, but we also want to help them in strategy and things that they may not be um, thinking about doing. So that's what I mean by suggestions.
Thank you, Carissa.
Yeah.
That's the end of the questions. If you need a drink of water or anything, though, definitely we'll give you some time to do that before we hop into this next section. Yeah, I just thank you so much again for holding the space for us.
Thank you for creating space.
Sure thing. And I'll just say, folks, keep the questions coming in the chat. We should have some time at the end for some additional questions. So thanks.
I'm pretty cognizant that I have a bunch of slides. So do you think I should keep going?
Yeah, that's probably best. You do a bunch of slides. They're great slides too. So this will be fun.
Well, thanks for hanging in there, and we're gonna keep on going.
Actually, Riz, I don't know if you were going to share the video too, but that might be a fun thing to show.
Yeah, do you want me to do it now or you want at the end of the presentation?
Let's do it now. It's a good video.
Okay, well, sorry folks, I'm gonna switch up my screen real quick. And I might fast forward through a few points, but so you're gonna get an in-depth look at compost pile in the winter. Um, and it, this is just a microscope that I plug into my computer, and it's not the best tool. It's a little clunky, but I just like looking at compost. So I it's really short. I have more, but it's a lot of data, so just gonna keep it short. What it is.
You might need to stop sharing your current screen and reshare your screen too, because we're still seeing the PowerPoint.
That is definitely what I need to do. How about
All
now?
right, that looks great.
Okay, so if I fast forward, it's um, just because it takes time to watch compost. So that's a little springtail moving around. And then I think these are pot worms um, down at the bottom. And I always notice these little green specks everywhere, and they look like they're vibrating. So it's something that the microscope's not picking up on, but probably more on the bacterial or smaller phase. And so at the top, you're seeing a potworm. And if you know like how I'd call it juicy or slimy everything is, there's definitely some oozing um, going on there. And this is the type of compost where you can still delineate what everything is. And so um, you're seeing wood chips and then anything that's basically come out of our kitchen as well as our rabbit tray and just the the red worms here were a lot. I was so surprised because it's March, and our compost isn't huge. It is freezing at the bottom, but at the top, they were definitely active. And so it's a little mite on the bottom. Um, a lot of activity going on that you can't, other than the worms, you can't really see to the naked eye um, unless you're really looking. So thanks for letting me share.
Thanks, Risa. That was so cool.
Oh no.
Oh, oh,
All right, practical application.
looks great on our end.
Thank you. Um, approach. So you're looking for tangible solutions and you're getting curious, you know, example questions. Have you tracked your costs for that field? Have you seen yield reductions? Is that standpipe working still? Are you planting later than in the past? These are the type of questions where if somebody isn't quite connecting the dots or really into like the steps to take and why to take them, in some of the issues that you might be seeing. This is from a different context of, you know, some of the issues that they may be seeing, they may not be connecting the dots that they can plant cover crops and have a different outcome, those type of things. Uh, do you have time to do a shovel test with me? Do you have soil tests on that field? Any interest in cash tests? And I behoove you to listen and refrain from any initial prescription if able. Um, and then I think I think of Heather Darby as the queen of this, saying the same thing on a million different ways based on context. So making it familiar to them, making it helping to make it digestible. Explain it to the degree of how you feel comfortable. Um, it's going to sound foreign to them if you explain it how a professor or a coworker taught you. Say it in the way that you see it, understand it, um, can share it. And I'd also potentially, no matter how you see something, but like in the conversation that you're having with the farmer about soil health, refrain from good, bad. It just is because what this kind of removes some of the judgment characteristics that we tend to have. And this is kind of a wider conversation, but just for folks who aren't comfortable, um, for folks who aren't comfortable with some of the situations and um, don't know how to sound neutral. There we go. Uh, I love working with farmers. Um, they're really capable and inquisitive and wonderful human beings that are very grounded, I find, which is probably why I like working with them so much. The conversations can be quite stimulating, and I would say don't force your viewpoint based on their context, what would help them. It might be applying for a program, it might not be. Admit when you're not sure. It's across the board. I think everybody has come into those situations, no matter where you come from. Um, we're not going to know everything all the time, and we shouldn't have to, you know. That's why we got like such great technical advisors, great group of folks that been there, done that, you know. Ask them. And it might be a question that, which I think the questions that have been asked in this program are really great because these are questions that haven't been asked before or somebody didn't feel comfortable asking. Um, and communication is really important when ambiguity is part of the process. So what I mean by that is you might be talking to them about a program, and let's say that program hasn't given all their information or they don't know who's going to rank out. Make sure the farmer knows that that is not known, that it's still up in the air. Um, yeah. It, and that's just programmatically, but soil health in and of itself has think about how much that has grown and how much is still not known potentially. So that's ambiguity. And to say you're not quite sure is fine, but try to find that answer for them or trying to find a solution or try to find somebody that knows potentially. All right, switching into some farm situations like practicality. So what is going on below ground with this management? And you're welcome to answer in the chat, but from a soil health perspective, some of the things that we could toss out there, um, compaction, and the compaction may not be the type that you might think of. That field on the right might be completely root bound in the top 2 inches. What I mean by that is all the roots are going horizontally, they're interlaced, and then there's nothing below the next 2 inches. And so I think Josh talked about when the soil is dry and he talked about crusting on annual fields, you will find the same thing in a perennial field where you dig down 3 inches and it's dry as a bone and we just got an inch of rain. Um, it can have the same effect. On the left-hand side, I will say this is one season where a farmer decided that they were going to rotate a bit more. And we did this paddock by paddock. And um, like, I just want to say, wow, it looks like they clipped on the right, right? Versus the left. But the whole hillside looked like that the season before. They made a difference. So the reason why it still looks that way on the right is they were holding I think it was either a dry cow or heifer there. But big difference and a big part of the soil health on a landscape scale. Um, I'd like to see if anybody's got an answer for this. Who's making the soil health decisions on this land, the animal or the farmer?
There are a couple of responses in the chat. I said animal and Kate said both.
Yeah, both. But primarily, I mean, the animal's doing a lot of the work, right? That that animal integration, they can make a big difference on the landscape. And so let's say, for instance, let's just say that on the right hand side, the farmer was clipping or haying versus the animal on the left hand side is strategically picking species as well as depositing manure simultaneously, but they are also moving biology around that whole field for that farmer versus like just the one mechanical cut. And I'm not saying good, bad, and different. I'm just saying it's different. And so by that animal um, grazing, choosing, nibbling versus the uniform management decision across the other field will show up in the soil biology over time. Um, Jeff Sanders delayed, talked about nitrogen application within no-till systems, I believe. And this is kind of a different way of saying that, but from a biological point of view. And so the one on the left-hand side, so you've got residues with high carbon and nitrogen ratio added to the soil, and then you have a response from the bacterial population. So you have an offset initially of the bacteria are utilizing all the free nitrogen in that system to break down that carbon. And so there's a delayed response when you have that addition or that tilling or that application or I don't want to call it disturbance, but that process. And then the nitrate level of the soil is kind of released within that system. And over time, based on input and based on how much carbon they can utilize, you could either remove the carbon or you can add it for the longer term. Great chart in the book about this and adding a little bit more. So, you know, we try to keep all the tools in the toolbox for a farmer to make their decisions because at the end of the day, we need crops, we need feed, we want to keep farming producing. And so there is a balance within that. So if I till, I need to add that carbon back some way. Um, if I'm going to take a cut, how am I giving back? Um, If I decide to overgraze, how do I balance that situation out? Um, Stagnant management. Uh, the the farms are diverse, the soil is diverse, everything kind of needs to be diverse. So the stagnant management can also be something that needs to be balanced out, I would say. If the soil's saturated and they keep going out there no matter what the soil condition is, how are we going to balance that back out? Um, Distribution of nutrients on both sides, import export of feed balance, like it, it's all a balance. And so if you can, in your soil health management planning, figure out, okay, how do we balance these situations out, whether that's putting carbon back into a system, whether it be bringing the fertility up. And what I mean by fertility might be compost, manure, whatever else they need in the toolbox. These are, it's just a kind of think of a giant teeter-totter, that funneled thing. Um, yeah, it's um, it's a balance, and it's all around us. The nature shows us this all the time. Right? So you've learned about soil health principles, and now it might be like creating more dialogue around those soil health principles. So this this might come down to crops. It might come down to um, land use. It might come down to what type of animals they're using um, on the farm or thinking about using. How are they um, how are they going to balance out that disturbance? And we pretty much hit that with the previous slide. So I'm gonna keep going. So compaction. Uh, you can feel it in the spade. We talk about penetrometer. Yep. Also you can feel it in the spade and that middle picture, it's hard to see, but it basically below the first top 2 inches, it kind of falls apart. There's um those top 2 inches, like what I ask a farmer to do sometimes is to tear apart that clod, um, and or that turf, so to speak. And it can be very difficult. Like y- you have to use a freaking soil knife. But on the edge of the field, it might tear completely apart, you know, helping them to feel the impact of the management as well. And then the compaction, like it's visually there, but sometimes it's not always visually there in the shovel. There are other factors like what are the roots doing? What's the spade feel like when you put it in? Okay, so we're still on the topic of disturbance, um, in a different way, a different disturbance. So something that is worth noting is Vermont and maybe New England are unique from a lot of the lower 48 by, when we do these Russell runs and we try to estimate what the erosion is and everything, it might say zero erosion, like it's going to be great. I just kidding. And it it is a calculation, it's a tool in the toolbox, but it may not, you might also be seeing different things in the field. And so these really large flat fields can be um, a little like pretty interesting. So large flat field, tiled, seeing massive erosion. Um, that's one goalie of like 4 or 5, and it just kept getting worse because they were losing the topsoil, they were just tilling back in, and so they were actually utilizing subsoil. And so it was more highly erodible year after year. And the thing that we may not see throughout the rest of the season is if this field is frozen, let's say like the top 2 inches thaw out, but s- below that it's frozen, what are your infiltration rates? What is that like, especially this winter? What was that field doing um, in March, April, and up until the time that they planted? So until that frozen zone, frost zone left. So this is also part of hydrology and engineering, right, Lauren? Um, you plug the soils in and it might give out a number like, this is going to be your velocity, your rate. But I would submit to you, like, if the ground is frozen and the top 2 inches are thawed, you're getting a lot more water coming off that field in a confluent way than you would expect when you're just snapshotting it out there. Um, Now, granted, you do not see a cover crop on the right, you know, and I don't think at this time they were doing any type of reduced tillage. But in the next slide, so you got an aerial view of approximately right in this area where that picture was taken. And then this is an example of having conversations with the farm, saying, hey, I noticed this, and then I think it took a couple of years before I actually got into the site and like, let's talk about this because it's becoming a huge issue for you. I can see. Um, and so we were having a conversation out there, and I said, well, we're putting out all different types of ways that they go about it. And they had already started dabbling in the cover crop and reduced till. So that was great on the whole landscape scale. And now it was like a matter of really mitigating the loss that they were seeing or the sedimentation that we're seeing off the field as well. And I said, have you ever thought about reorientating the field? And they were like, no, they just had never thought about it because it was a habit, a very, very small habit and just a small perspective change. And so they changed the orientation of the field and seeded down the entire edge of field in addition to the other agronomic practices that they were doing. And so that's just one of those really small changes that can happen on the landscape through some persistence and some like just discussion and keeping at it.
Hey, Rissa, can you just clarify what you mean by reorienting the field? I think I know what you mean, but if you could just be a little bit more explicit about what you mean.
Sorry. Yep, thanks. So originally going east to west or west to east, or yeah, east to west, and then going south to north in their rows, in their planting.
Thank you.
Yep. Just barely visible on the shot, but it's there. So principles, again, living cover. So any way, shape, or form that you can have a conversation and help make it relevant about the processes that they're doing and potentially seeing it a different way. And this is the whole like saying the same thing, but trying to make it more familiar, more digestible, potentially more relatable. Um, but we all perceive things and we all um, understand things differently. And so sometimes it just takes that keep at it. And I like in some of the old nutrient management plans, they had the farmer write out a bunch of information rather than like a question answer verbally. And I always got more context out of that when a farmer was able to, whenever they had any free time, um, when they could write out and put pen to paper, it almost like it's almost like a different facet of how the brain works. Like I would get there would just be so much more information. And like, especially if I went back and before going out to a farm and read it, um, that would be great. But there's also been ones that I saw years after I worked with them, like I never knew that, like because it never came up in conversation. But yeah, so if you can get also like potentially like a fill out of what you're trying to really focus on, that might be helpful too. So living color cover, thinking about cover crops. All right, so diversifying. Diversifying is really interesting because we tend to think about that in crop rotation and just a few different facets, but it can also be your livestock integration. And so a lot of farms that are looking to diversify things, you know, or saying that they would want to change the ways that they are managing the land, or they're looking at doing a new practice, but they don't know how they're going to get it done. Can livestock be a part of the solution? Um, is it going to create complexity? Absolutely. Uh, that is to the degree of the farm you're working with. You know, everybody's gonna be different. Some are gonna be like, yeah, I thought about doing that, or no way, and you know what? Sometimes when I'm talking to farmers, sometimes I am just slinging things on the wall. Like, what about this? What about that? What about this? And not not in a way that overwhelms them, but at the same time, like fleshing out ideas or a strategy that they could think about. Scalable assistance. What I mean by this is their economy of scale. So generally speaking, the larger a farm is, if if they buy a tractor and they've got X amount of acres, 500 acres versus two, like that's a big difference in economy of scale. Same thing happens when we talk about construction projects. Um, but now NRCS and maybe some of the other programmatic options are going on a per 1,000 feet basis. And so this changes the threshold of economy of scale and helps us open up ways of applying some of these soil health practices onto smaller diversified farms. Um, adds complexity, absolutely. Uh, but some of these farms are producing a massive amount of food. They also might have a lot of nutrients that they have to manage. So, not that I not necessarily trying to put anything on a radar or anything, but they are extremely diverse ecologically in their farming practices, and they are definitely adding to our um, local community food, and if not even farther out. Uh, and I hope that we continue to add to their economy of scale in any way we possibly can. Adding living roots. So, like, oh yeah, we have a living plant. What about, adding living roots? Like, duh, isn't that the same thing? Roots can be very different, right? So sometimes when we're talking about living cover, we're talking about one cover crop type. But sometimes the soil, as it tends to do, it'll be showing us different ecological functions that it would like to see. And what I mean by that is like um, tap roots, fibrous roots, forbs, they tend to be the initial like soil conditioners. Um, sometimes when you get that top 2 inches and like all the roots are in the same area, like, are we really utilizing that soil profile? Can we get a diversification so that they're not all competing in the same way? Also, when you're just looking at soil, um, are they horizontal? I mean, rhizomes are one thing, so like some grass species, they're all at the same level. But if everything's there, then it gives you context on what's going on in the soil, maybe a perched water table. maybe bedrock, maybe, just did an assessment. Are they stunted, frayed, or brown? Like, are they healthy white roots? Is this a disease? Is this um, an issue in the soil as far as fertility? So, yeah, that animal integration. So, animals move a lot of biology around, and now that we've been developing it for a while, but it's becoming even more of a focus on the biological aspect of soil. Um, how is that limited on this farm? So if that farm has um, one type of livestock and they always pasture in the same area, is there another horizon those cows can see? Is there another way to integrate them on a different part of the farm? Are there biologically active areas on the farm that those cows could potentially utilize and move to another area and move, whether that may be hoof on their actual bodies, that may be coming out the back end? Um, yeah, they are moving that biology. So, are there ways that this farm can reduce the stagnancy of what they might be seeing on the landscape? Because the landscape, even though, yes, we do have to have some form of monoculture in some ways, depending on what the farm's creating, we can also try to integrate more biology into that system. Um, so also thinking about manure and compost for sure. Um, and how can that be beneficial to what you're seeing on this in the soil profile? So is it just an example of cows grazing a cover crop? Okay, so a couple other, I apologize for everybody. This is, I'm realizing, very dairy or very corn hay focused, but um, we have a lot of it in Franklin County, which is great too. So this is a farm that was having huge amounts of I call them classic gullies because I mean when they can't quite be plowed, um, they kind of figuratively go into a classic scenario. But they were losing quite a bit of sediment. I mean, basically slumping. And this is a farm that the historical aspect of the land came into it wasn't identified originally, but then like trying to figure out like why is this so active? Because the Russell wasn't really showing that it should be eroding this much. Back when they did land leveling or trying to level out this landscape a bit, they buried the topsoil. And so we were seeing the decomposition of the top of the organic matter buried in that, and it was kind of creating an opportunistic water pathway, like Josh was kind of mentioning, like and undermining the actual profile of the soil, and so then it was collapsing in on itself and eroding. So seeding those areas down, as well as squaring up some of the fields, which was also helpful to this farmer, and yeah, they were also increasing their rotation, doing cover crop, and reducing the till, and saw a lot of benefits and a lot less topsoil loss. And then another area that they were thinking about putting into corn, we had a discussion that it may not be, it might result in the same situation that was happening in these other fields. And so instead of that, um, we reinvigorated the field um, through a no-till seeding. So to try to help them in the yield, plus talking and revisiting the fertility of the field for production reasons. So they didn't feel the need as much to put the corn in. You may have heard this. or it may not have. But if you ever do, my pastures are struggling. I'm supplementing them more and more in July and August. I think they need to be plowed and replanted. Um, in a in a pasture situation, a reseeding is not to be taken lightly because it's going to reduce the amount of land that they can pasture, first off. So it's changing the amount of paddock acreage they have, so to speak. And it's it might take it might take up to a year to establish, and then it's a risk as well, on breaking everything out and then reestablishing. So we need to reseed, reestablish. Let's say that that's what you're being told, and that's what the practice that's being applied for. But you are seeing that the, I'll call it disturbance, but also overgrazing. Let's just say that that's out of balance and they're taking a bit more and the plants aren't able to recover within that time frame. That conversation, while be might be hard, needs to be had. So getting a soil test on it, that's also important. Anytime you're talking about a reseed, spade assessment, also important because it might not just it it might be something different, but you might be able to further assess um, any issues within the grazing system. So just saying, can we definitely address or try to figure out what the limiting factor is first before that complete reset of the soil. And a lot of times, not all the time, but some pasture fields, there's a reason why it's pasture versus a crop field, and it might be even more difficult than they think to reestablish. I've also seen fields where they um, tried to reestablish it, and when they tilled it, and this was before this actual farmer, they created a subcompaction in the lower field because of all the soil particles that basically settled down, and it was highly compacted below ground and almost like creating a perched water table. And that was prior to that farmer, so we couldn't really say like exactly what happened, but that was other things to be taken into consideration. And then with soil health, like that balance factor. So how are we planning on giving back if we're always taking a cutoff? Um, on the left-hand side, that's a lot of residual sitting there. The animals have um, trampled that. So then once they trample it, the bacteria can get at it and it can start become the system, or it might just um, be another aspect of moisture retention and reduction in it might moderate the temperature more, and so it creates a canopy over that soil. And so for our cool season grasses, especially in a pasture system, it's just one more additive effect of the cool season grass to continue growing. Additional consideration. So do they need to import nutrients? Do they need to export? This is that whole nutrient balance. Do they need to close the gap more? And how do they close that gap? And where are they losing nutrient efficiency? Um, this might be in the actual livestock that they have. So um, rumens function very different than monogastric species. And so some of the phosphorus feeds don't really get digested, and they come onto the farm in a high level, and they come and they're in the manure at a high level as well. And how are we going to balance those things out over time? So learning the lessons, big changes start small, do it, and then observe it. This might be adding a paddock, changing a habit, right? Applying the compost. How long that compost been sitting there? Like, let's get it back on the field. let's utilize it when it's ready. Um, and are they making milk by cleaning up at the end of the season? So the energy that it takes that, let's say dairy cow to go out to that paddock, is it the same that they're getting off that landscape? And how does that potentially set back that plant productivity or soil health for the next year? Okay, this one, how many tons of lime or ash can the soil biology take? How many tons of compost or gallons of manure can the soil biology take? If anybody's got an answer for that, let me know. Especially if the farm is not able to incorporate those amendments. And let's say we have a drought. Okay, so this picture, let's say we've got this scenario in front of us, and you're hearing from the farmer, I have high somatic cell counts. I don't have enough manure. I had to apply fertilizer this year. I'm having issues breeding. My herd is not utilizing the pastures. So from various different angles, ways to think about these things is potentially, you know, um, can we get these animals out on the landscape, moving that biology, applying those nutrients? Um, or is this a labor thing? Or is it an infrastructure? Or is it a time management? Um, I don't have enough manure. I had to apply fertilizer this year, or you're seeing it in the soil test. Are there places that are being excessively added on the farm in areas that we could have those animals out on the landscape, putting those nutrients out there instead of one concentrated area? I'm having issues breeding. The younger stock, what's their body condition? And how are they learning to use the pastures if they're not grazing? And like all of a sudden, like they go, let's say 2 years, and then all of a sudden they get put out on a pasture. Like, where did they learn to graze? Just things to think about. Um, yeah, comfort level, it's all context based. And these are a few scenarios. And for anybody reviewing this, can take a snapshot. But I think time-wise, Lauren, how am I doing?
We are past 4, but if you want to keep going, that's fine.
Okay, sorry, I can't see a clock from where I'm sitting. So let's stop there and take anybody's questions if there are any.
There aren't any comments or questions in the chat as of now. But please, folks, feel free to keep adding. I guess how I'll phrase that. We do have a comment that we always love to hear more from you. So if you do want to finish up, I think those who can stay will.
Uh, Thank you for that comment. That was very kind of you to say. No, I just biologically, uh, as above, so below. Like if we want the diversity below ground, we got to have it above ground. And if we want the diversity above ground, we got to have it below ground, in a weird way, but not in a weird way. It's just reflective. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, everything everybody mentioned as far as resources, I thought were excellent. If you want more um, local guides, and then Jeff Lowenfels, he is a backyard gardener, and he's not going to talk about animal integration, but he's got some great pictures and context, and for any like easy reading for soil biology, if you don't want to get in too much of the weeds of it, um, it's very relatable and comprehensive, and fun to think about. Yep. And then Forage ID, there's a PDF that's been tossed around, and I'd say print it and laminate it and use it for your field resource. Um, and that's plant ID, but it goes into everything we were talking about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rissa. I do just want to, if folks do have questions, I imagine, Rissa, you'd be willing to stay on for a little while. So feel free to come off of mute or toss some things in the chat as you're able. Um, and as I'm doing that, hopefully folks can see my screen. Here again are the dates for the in-field summer trainings. I will again send an email out with that information. If you didn't set up your campus course yet, please still do. The resources are going to stay up there indefinitely as far as we know. So please do set that up just so you have access to all of these things. Everything's also on YouTube on a playlist. And so feel free to check those out and send that to others. Just really want to encourage folks to use what you learned here out in the field. Obviously, we'll be going out starting in June, but I know a lot of folks are working with farms between now and June. So please go back to these resources, find new resources, and let's see if we can't help some farms this spring. Mel also just tossed into the chat two different evaluation forms, which I know you're all very excited for. One is the regular each webinar evaluation form, and then there's also one for the entire series, as well as requesting some information about what you'd like to see in the in-field summer workshops. So please, if you're able, fill that out. That'll also go out in an email, but would really appreciate everyone's input so we can make sure we tailor those events to what you're looking for. With that, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. Just
I, oh,
yeah,
sorry.
sorry, go ahead, Mel.
I was just gonna say, I don't really have a comment. I don't really have a question, more of a comment. Thank you so much for going through those detailed examples. But it just really like pressed home to me how complicated this all is, and just makes me respect folks working on soil health all the more. So
Thanks, Mel. I would definitely second that. I think if nothing else, these 12 webinars have taught me just keep working at it and learning things. And maybe one day I'll feel more competent. But I think it is a good reminder that just this is all really complicated stuff, and sticking with it and the experience really can't be underrated or understated. Just having so many experiences on farms and being able to draw those own connections and trainings together. I'm seeing a lot of gratitude for Carissa in the chat as well. So thank you once again, Carissa, and just blanket to all of the speakers that we've had on this webinar series. Couldn't have done it without you. Um, and obviously all of the participants who asked some really great questions, came to learn. Just thank you all for being part of this webinar series. And we truly, truly do hope to see folks at the in-field summer workshops. Really excited for those to keep this learning journey going. So let us know if you have any ideas or suggestions or questions. And please be in touch with all of the speakers who came. They all listed their email addresses, or if not, they are definitely Googleable, because that's probably how I found them. So feel free to reach out to those folks and ask follow-up questions. And just thank you everyone for being here. And happy almost spring, apparently. Yeah, Rissa.
Lauren, one thing, so, and it needs to be reiterated. So Willie said superb webinar series. Thank you all. And I will definitely, yeah, elevate that. It's great that you made this resource for the state and for anybody else that is interested in soil health.
Thanks, Riss. Appreciate it. With that, we will bring this webinar series to a close. Thanks, everyone.